Hello, 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 everyone, and thank you for joining today's Black and Latinx Roundtable with Columbia faculty. My name is Melissa Mayard, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Associate Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at the Office of University Life. My pronouns are she, her, hers. This event is part of University Life's Graduate Initiative for Inclusion and Engagement, which promotes Columbia's commitment to diversity and the success of all graduate and professional school students, and is co-sponsored by the Office of the Vice Provost for Faculty Advancement. University Life's diversity roundtables, such as this one, aim to provide opportunities for students, faculty, and staff to have informal yet meaningful conversations through open discussions on critical student life issues. This event will hopefully reinforce that you belong here, that there are a multitude of ways to build community that supports and cares about you at Columbia, and that you too can thrive while working towards your own academic goals. Before I turn it over to our esteemed panelists and moderators, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. First, this program will be recorded and shared via University Life's YouTube channel. If you have any questions about this recording, please contact our office. Also, please make sure to remain muted. Towards the end of the roundtable, there'll be an opportunity for questions, and we ask that you type your questions into the chat box so we can answer as many as possible. We also recommend that you keep your view on speaker view versus gallery view. Now, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Please note, these are shortened and abbreviated bios. Each of our panelists have achieved tremendous accomplishments, and I encourage you to look into them in more depth after today's events. First off, we have Dr. Dustin Duncan. Dr. Duncan is an associate professor of epidemiology at the Mailman School of Public Health. He is a social and spatial epidemiologist studying how neighborhood characteristics influence population health and health disparities. Dr. Duncan's intersectional research focuses on Black, gay, bisexual, and other sexual minority men and transgender women of color. Next, we have Dr. Francis Negrón-Muntaner. Currently a professor of English and comparative literature, Dr. Negrón-Muntaner is an award-winning filmmaker, writer, and scholar. She also directs Columbia Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race and has edited and authored several books as well as films surrounding the Latinx experience. Our next panelist, Dr. Jasmine McDonald. Dr. McDonald is an assistant professor of epidemiology at Mailman with multidisciplinary training in infectious disease, breast cancer, epidemiology, and molecular epidemiology. Much of her portfolio is nested within populations that have a higher burden of cancer, including those with a genetic predisposition, racial and ethnic minorities, and young women. Our final panelist, Dr. Marcel Agüeros. Dr. Agüeros is an associate professor of astronomy. His research interest is in observational stellar astrophysics, and specifically in using new data sets and technologies to address classic questions in stellar evolution. Dr. Agüeros has worked on increasing the number of women and underrepresented minorities in the sciences throughout his career, as seen through his work in launching and directed the Bridge to the PhD program in STEM here at Columbia. And last but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Dennis Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell is the Vice Provost for Faculty Advancement here at Columbia and is also a professor of dental medicine at the Medical Center. He is focused on building programs to diversify the health professions throughout his career, as he also serves as the Senior Associate Dean for Diversity for the College of Dental Medicine, where he became, in 2004, the first diversity-focused dean at a U.S. dental school. These are our incredible panelists for today's event. And with that, please join me in welcoming them as I turn it over to our moderator, Dr. Mitchell. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. It's a pleasure to be here with this incredible panel. Some have become dear colleagues and friends of mine over the years, and some are newer to Columbia that I'm just getting to meet. So what I love about the diversity of this panel is also in your experiences in your careers. So I want to start off with sort of a softball question to all of you. And what is your story? Tell us your story. How did you get interested in your field? How did you get to this point in your career? What is unique about you? And I'm going to start, I think I'll throw the first one out to our first our newest faculty member here, and that's to you, Dustin. So I'm just going to follow my screen, which is Dustin, Francis, Jasmine, and Marcel. So Dustin, go right ahead.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mitchell. So I became interested in public health through kind of coursework. I'm in a public space, hence I'm wearing a mask. But one of my professors from college, Dr. Bill Jenkins, who is known for identifying the Tuskegee, the unethical aspect of the Tuskegee experiment, taught me epidemiology in college. And so basically I started to be interested in public health and epidemiology, but he became a father figure in some ways, and definitely a strong mentor. And he just basically, we were just talking after class about epidemiology and public health and what was interesting. And he kept pushing me to think through what were the questions that I have. And then I kept getting different experiences in public health research at different schools, particularly Royal School of Medicine, Emory, very local experiences, then NIH as a college student. And then I just kind of kept growing from there and learning about what was new, what was interesting to me. And then it really became a passion because I realized that I wouldn't say change the world because that sounds perhaps trite, but make an impact in my way on improving the health of communities that I really care about. So I really honestly started with the college professor who still very much is someone who, he's now passed, but who has had a significant impact on my career and many, many others.
Thank you, Dustin. How about you, Francis?
Well, everyone that knows me or has read about me probably knows that I'm a third generation academic, that my maternal grandmother, my father's side, my parents, my sister, my uncles, and myself are all academics. And in that sense, to me, this was actually not my choice. I went kicking and screaming to academia, thinking it was more like the family business. But I want to emphasize that I think I ended up not so much an academic, but someone who posed the kinds of questions that I do, to a large extent because I grew up in Puerto Rico, which is a so-called unincorporated territory of the US. And I think if you grow up in a colonial context, one of the first questions that you ask is why? And I think that question of why is this community a colony? Why are such enormous power differentials exist in the world between nation states and other territories, between people, and the fact that a lot of my father's work was about 19th century histories of enslavement in Puerto Rico, I think also added to that question of why does racism and other hierarchies of power exist. I think it's the thorough line between all that I do in all the areas that I work in, which include scholarship, but also include art and film and advocacy and activism.
Well,
I made the muted mistake. Jasmine, please go right ahead.
so making the link back to Dustin. So I'm actually from Tuskegee, Alabama, and I started out where college was not even a question. I mean, I was going to college classes with my cousins and my mom and my dad before I was even in kindergarten. My dad grew up next to a Tuskegee Airmen, and there was the Commodores. And so for me, I was raised in an environment where you could be anything as a Black person. Like there was just no limit. When I went to Maryland as for the rest of my childhood, there was just no question that I was going to get an education. But similar to Francis, I really didn't want to go get an education. I did not like school. So I was kind of kicking and screaming against even graduate school. But even my paternal grandmother went to Teachers College at Columbia with having 3 kids, with the youngest only being 3 years old, left that child in Alabama to go to New York to get her master's at Teachers College in public health, actually. And so I come from a long line of just grit and achievement that it was something that was very expected of me. It's like my family had its own internal academic pipeline.
Go ahead, Marcel.
Yeah, so thanks for the question, softball question, Dennis. I'm not sure how softball it really is. I grew up in New York City. I'm a second generation Manhattanite on my dad's side. His parents came from Puerto Rico. My mother is French. My mother's family is a immigrant family from all over Europe. And I would not say that Manhattan is a natural place to develop a passion for astronomy. And so in my case, it was a series of coincidences. And one of the major ones was actually spending a summer in Puerto Rico, not very far from where my grandparents lived. Well, my grandmother lived at the time. My grandfather had died by that point, at the Arecibo Observatory, which some of you may know collapsed tragically this past December. And that was really a transformational experience for me. It made me, it had the right combination of science community, and community more broadly that really motivated me to go on and become an astronomer. And it only took me another, 10 years to sort of really commit to that idea. So this sounds very linear, but it wasn't at all. And then I was actually a Columbia undergrad. And so here I am back teaching in the same department where I got my undergraduate degree, which also seems somehow very linear, but was totally not, a series of fortuitous coincidences along the way. And in terms of, sort of how I got here, I would also say that to me, I love my research. I'm excited about the fact that I get to think about totally impractical things like the evolution of stars over billions of years, and that people pay me for it. But I also really felt that I needed to stay engaged in some kind of community work to be thinking about people as part of that. And so for me, part of the goal has always been to have a balance between this very sort of selfish intellectual activity that I enjoy so much and something that felt more connected to the world around me.
That's wonderful. Of all of you, I'm going to keep it soft. Let's talk about some accomplishments and achievements, points of pride for you all in your, if you were to name one or two particular things in your career focused, that you consider accomplishments, points of pride that you'd like to share with our students, please do that. Like, I'm going to jump back to you, Dustin, and then Francis, Jasmine, Marcel.
Oh, wow. These really, I would agree with Marcel, which is my nephew's name, but these aren't really softball questions. And I get to answer them first. Okay. I think the biggest thing for me is truly mentorship. I really like to see, it's not, I mean, it sounds trite, but it's certainly true to anyone who knows me at any level. I like to see people do well. I like to surround myself with people who do well, and I like for people to do well. Last year, I won the Mentor of the Year award, which was surprising. I was at Columbia just under a year at that point, so I didn't expect that. I didn't even know the award existed, quite frankly, but I later learned that two of my staff members, one a research scientist and one a postdoctoral fellow in our group, independently recommended me, thanks Jasmine, recommended me for the award. And I mean, it felt good because I really do care about it. I would say that pride is the award, but just seeing people do well. I mean, now I can see, like, I have students who are now professors and have papers and are writing their first grants and getting grants. And I mean, it makes me feel old, quite frankly, but it makes me feel so, it makes me feel like I'm making the impact that I want. I would say that that's probably one of the, and probably the biggest thing, or at least something that I think about now. Like, how do I make an impact, and how do I make meaningful connections for people to, strategically get where they went in their careers. And for me, like, that's particularly focused around, students who are, I won't use the term disadvantaged, but students who have less privilege in society, including Black and brown students.
Jump in.
Yes, Francis, go right ahead.
I think I'm at the age where you wonder if you accomplished anything at all. So I'm not sure I would speak in terms of accomplishments, but I have mapped out some of the things that give me the most joy. And I think they have some things in common. There are things that I learn, that I feel creative and I feel connected, and that open new possibilities, whether that's for people, for questions, for spaces, for ideas, for worlds to come into being. And as Dustin, I think mentorship is one of those areas that provides tremendous joy, because you do all those things. You learn from other people. You can be part of opening up possibilities. And I would say just mention one project, because I became so much more aware about this in that project, which is 2019. I started a project on a community currency in Puerto Rico to talk about solidarity economies. And one of the things that happened is that the people that participated in the project had so much joy in being part, that I realized how much joy was not front and center to the work and to the life that I was leading to that point. So I would say that if you want to use the word of accomplishment, an accomplishment would be to be more in that joyous space, doing what we love with other people.
Francis, I'm sharing your bills on the screen right now so people can see them.
There you go.
I'm with you, Marcel. I've got a dozen accomplishments myself that I could just lay right out there for Francis. Don't even try it, Francis.
That's amazing. So I would say for me, like, one biggest accomplishment, I think, for my career is that it's been based off of what I wanted to do. And so I really love what I do in every aspect of it. And that leads me to my second, is that, you know, people will be naysayers in like what you choose to put your passions in, especially if you're on the tenure track. And I do remember when I first, before I became assistant professor, I was encouraged not to get involved with a lot of mentoring. And I said, well, you know, I really want to be a director of a mentoring program. And I was really told, like, well, you get tenure, you can do that for the rest of your life, but first you got to get tenure. And then I responded with, well, if I don't get tenure, then what would I have to show for it? Like, would I have given what I wanted to Black and Brown and those who are less privileged? Would I have been able to give that? And I don't know if I'm gonna get tenure, but I know I can give this now. So I'm gonna invest what I can give now. And I did it. So I'm a co-director of the CURE program that's at the Cancer Center, where we've seen over 50 Black and Brown, socially disadvantaged, first generation, high school and undergraduate students. And this pipeline program that, you know, I started with Dr. Terry, but it was a lot of just like personal passion to educate the next generation and give them opportunities, and to see that pipeline go from them being in high school to having full college tuition, or being at Yale School of Public Health, or actually being accepted at Columbia College. I think that's been my greatest achievement, because it's one of the things that I say, if I don't get tenure, would it have been worth it? And for me, seeing all the people that I have trained, the answer would be yes.
So amen to all of those accomplishments that people have described, and thank you for those. I guess I would point to two things that maybe aren't not obvious, like looking at my CV or whatever. I think one is that I was a student activist when I was an undergraduate around ethnic studies at Columbia. And as a consequence of that activism, the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race, which Francis directed for a while, was created, and has brought a whole intellectual space to Columbia that just did not exist. That was a criminal neglect, in my opinion, that is only now, you know, starting to be addressed. I mean, I think what the center does is incredible, and every time I get to interact with students who are majoring in the various areas that the center has, I'm really just grateful and impressed by what they're doing. So that's one. And then the second one is more maybe esoteric, and that is that my father was a longtime director of the Museo de Barrio on Fifth Avenue between 103rd and 104th Street. And one of the traditions that he brought there from a previous job of his, which was down on the Lower East Side, was a parade on January 6th for the Three Kings Day, which in Puerto Rico and in other parts of the Spanish-speaking world is at least as big as Christmas, if not bigger. And so as a kid, I participated in the parade every year, and it's one of my fondest memories growing up. And the museo has continued that tradition. And a couple of years ago, they asked me to be an honorary padrino, which is just someone whose accomplishments they recognized. And I think they did it mostly because I'm my dad's son. I don't think it had anything to do particularly with my own accomplishments, but I didn't care. And it was just a wonderful, they actually had a costume. One part of the costume was sort of designated for my dad, and so I got to wear that, and he died a few years ago now, so it was really a wonderful way of kind of honoring his memory and his legacy. And so that's on my CV. I don't think anybody who looks at it has any idea what it means, but to have been an honorary padrino at the Museo's Three Kings Day Parade is one of my signal achievements of my career.
That's wonderful. The majority of our audience today are Black and Brown graduate students here at Columbia. So I'm going to ask you all to sort of think back to your graduate school life and lives, and share with us any difficulties or challenges that sort of predominate for you that you can remember in that time, and how you what did it take to overcome them? What are there lessons from that you could share? But both the difficult experiences, but also how you moved through those. And Dustin, we'll start back with you again.
Gosh, I can't think of any difficult times, honestly. Okay, I'll provide an answer, but I'm not sure it's a difficult time. But I think the grad school is challenging. I had a couple of my friends and colleagues, but mainly friends, including friends who are in the field, say that this was easy for me, for their perception that me being academic and being a student, it was easy for me. And I said, that's not true at all. Actually, it's really difficult. I was a student who stayed up late working. I was a student who was there or tried to be there. I would say time management and chronically kind of reprioritizing work and what to work on has been something that I wouldn't say is difficult, but something that I have to think through as a student, knowing what to do when, and I think definitely as a faculty member now. And so, again, I'm not sure it's something I would characterize as difficult, but I think it's something that it's really important, and as a graduate student and beyond, to be really mindful about what you take on, mindful about your bandwidth, mindful about the other things that are going on. So there's COVID that's happening, of course. Many of us are impacted in many different ways. I've had personal loss because of COVID. It impacted me like many others, and recognizing that, knowing the time and space that you need. And it's not just with COVID, but before COVID, we have families, we have existing lives and structures. And just, building that into your timeline, and also being transparent as you can with your colleagues and your mentors, and saying like, hey, I can't do that by this deadline because of, because I need to attend to a personal issue or whatever. But that was something that's, I think, has always been, again, I would say challenging, but something that I have to really be really mindful to in my day-to-day, which certainly predominates or has followed my trajectory. Like, of course, today I have to decide like what to take on, when do I email, when do I focus on other strategic priorities, right? To maximize my goal of being productive, whatever that means.
I know I have to be brief. So I think I would say that one of the most pressing memories that I have of that process is that, to me, it's intertwined with my migration to the United States. So I arrived in the US as a 19-year-old. I was, as I mentioned, grew up in an academic family, but I left Puerto Rico for graduate school. And I remember migrating alone. I had a very big, heavy suitcase. At that time, the suitcase did not have wheels. I remember kind of walking to University of Massachusetts in Amherst, not knowing practically anyone, and just trying to get that suitcase across a seemingly very long set of staircases and the like. So because it was intertwined with that process, I actually ended up leaving the university and prioritizing community in my choices of education. I moved to Philadelphia. I worked in a community newspaper for the Puerto Rican community. I started making films that spoke to the AIDS epidemic at the time. And then I went back to school. And in retrospect, you could see that I perhaps, because I prioritized community over the quote unquote best schools or best choices, formal education. But from that experience, I would say that I learned some things that have been very relevant to my experience in higher education since, which was that when you're a person that in many ways does not quote unquote fit. So there's an ill fit. And it's not so much that I don't feel I don't belong or that I'm not good enough, but that there are substantial differences in perspectives and between my education in Puerto Rico and the kinds of questions that animated my curiosity and my desire for change, and a lot of what I saw in higher education in the United States. So I would say that what it gave me was that in any context that one finds oneself, whether you feel that you're fit or not, it's very important to develop a strong sense of purpose and a strong sense of community. And that, I think, is what I would share or pass on to students who might feel, have some of those feelings or might describe their situation in those terms. Because when you have a sense of purpose and you have a sense of community, you can navigate a lot. When you're isolated and you feel that your problems are only yours and maybe it's you that's the problem, rather larger context and relations, the outcome can be very different. You can transform those feelings into change, as Marcel was talking earlier about the founding of the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race. That was an example of transforming deep dissatisfactions with how things were into something else by developing a purpose and working with other people towards transformation.
I have to echo that from Dustin, time management to a sense of purpose, and definitely a community, whether you're in graduate school and it's within your school or within the greater community that your school sits in. I learned all of that through my experience, and then I'll give you the additional things. So for me, Dustin and I both went to Harvard. We were both in the School of Public Health. He was actually in the School of Public Health. I was at GSAS, so Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. And I will say that I had the opposite experience of Dustin in the sense that I was mentored by someone who was abusive. He was verbally abusive. He was passive aggressive for 4 years. And so that really did something to me emotionally, mentally. Was my last semester where you're defending your thesis, your dissertation. And he told me, I'm not writing you any recommendations for doing a postdoc because you just aren't made out to be an academic. And I said, well, good for you. I'm not applying for academia. I'm applying for jobs. And what I learned in that whole time is to be vulnerable. So I didn't have advocates within the school itself, but I didn't have advocates within my program. But there was one girl that I knew who's also a friend with Dustin, Lori Dean, and we were on a bus going from Boston to Cambridge. And she was like, oh, what are you gonna do when you graduate? And I was like, I'm not gonna be in academia. And I used to take care of snails, which means I used to feed snails, and I used to take care of mice. And I was just like, I just want to be around people, like normal people. And so I told her my experience. She gave me a contact of a woman that she had been working with at University of Pennsylvania that was looking for a postdoc. It happened to be a very strong, educated Black woman named Shanita Hughes Halbert. And I was the only postdoc I applied to, and I was awarded it. If I did not allow myself to be vulnerable and tell Lori, who we weren't close friends, like Lori and I didn't hang out, Lori and I didn't, like she was someone I knew at school, but allowing myself to be vulnerable with someone who could possibly relate, somebody who was also brown, someone who was also in a minority and a majority population, like allowing myself to connect to that person, even though I didn't know her husband's first name, really set me on my path. If I was not vulnerable at that point, I would not be here. And so one of the things I would say is, graduate school for me, it took me going to University of Pennsylvania for 2 years to be able to have confidence in myself. But I would say, you're gonna experience things, but don't experience it in a silo, and don't keep it inside so much that you suppress opportunities. So be vulnerable, be expressive, and don't be ashamed.
Thank you for that. That's very powerful. I mean, I guess I would echo in some ways what Francis and Jasmine said, that things can seem very linear in retrospect, and then when you start looking at them a little more carefully, you realize that people's paths are not all that linear. So I mentioned at ICYMI was a turning point for me in terms of thinking about myself as a future astronomer, but I didn't actually go to graduate school with a PhD program until 4 years after I graduated from college. And my initial plan was actually to teach physics in the New York City public school system. That's kind of what I decided to do when I was an undergrad. And it just happened that I was like the alternate on this Columbia fellowship, and the person who was awarded got some other more prestigious fellowship. And so they told me, well, we can send you to the UK to study at Oxford or Cambridge for a couple of years. I was like, okay, well, I can't really pass that up. So I went to Cambridge, and I did essentially a degree that we don't have in the US, but it was like a 1-year research thesis based degree that for me was really a great opportunity to see whether or not a PhD kind of was something that I could invest in. Like, could I do that? Was it going to be fulfilling? Did I have the focus and the interest? And the answer was yes. And then it took me another 3 years to go to graduate school. So it took me a while to get to a PhD program. And then when I did, I went to the University of Washington in Seattle, and at that point I was 27. And most of my my colleagues in my entering class were fresh out of college. They were 22-year-olds. I'd lived at that point in a couple of countries in Europe. I'd been out of school. I'd been working. I'd been doing all these other things. I couldn't remember anything from my undergraduate curriculum. It was miserable. Like the first couple of years were just a misery. There wasn't any diversity really in the graduate student population, certainly not in the faculty. So it took a lot to kind of say, okay, well, I'm gonna persevere, because why not, sort of. And I think the things that got me through this, I think were things that have been hinted at here. We're finding people in similar situations outside of my own department, because there weren't any in my department. And one of the turning points for me was I was awarded a NASA fellowship, which they actually at the time was co-managed with the United Negro College Fund. And so it was a national program for 20 underrepresented minorities working in NASA-related areas of science. And had I known more about it, I probably wouldn't have applied for it, because it turns out that most of the people who got that fellowship were like NASA lifers. Like they'd started as NASA interns when they were 10 years old. And so I had no previous connection to NASA, but I was awarded it, and I got to meet, you know, Black and brown people who were doing their PhDs in related areas from across the country. And just last night, I called one of them down in Atlanta to be like, Manu, I just had the worst faculty meeting, you know, this month. And let me just vent at you for an hour about how mad I am about, you know. And so that network, you know, that network, those connections, that ability to reach out to other people who were doing, as my friend Eddie puts it, the academic shuffle, was immensely valuable in keeping my own, what sanity I have and what perspective I have along the way.
I really want to thank all of you for you know, that level of transparency in that question. So I'm going to continue on the path. You've all touched, you know, Francis, you talked about sort of fit, and Jasmine entirely about your experience. This idea about being Black and brown in this world, in the world of academia, and you know, oftentimes being the first at something, or we use a term in our office we call the lonely only, where you may not be the first. Francis, you're coming from 3 generations, but in your department, you sit as a lonely only. You know, what kind of impact does coming through academia and coming into a faculty life, what kind of impact does that have, and what kind of perseverance does it take to move through that on the faculty side now, not necessarily the graduate school side?
Okay, I'm going to take that on, but if it's okay, Dr. Mitchell, can I circle back to a point that Francis and Jasmine made earlier?
Absolutely, please do.
I mean, I think Jasmine's story, which I didn't expect you to bring up, I appreciate your candor, but knowing you, that sounds like I appreciate that, and I think that's important. You know, I think that, and it harkens back, I think, to the purpose of this, but community, mentorship, and advocacy, you know, at the same institution, people could have different experiences. With the same department, people have different experiences. Within the same mentor, people could have different experiences. One of my best friends, like absolute best friends in the world, and is also a social epidemiologist. We've had different experiences with the same mentor. I happen to have a really, really good experience overall. Not a lot of things systemically in my face, really. And maybe I was younger and I didn't understand dynamics of things a little bit, but not really. But I think Jasmine's point about being vulnerable is really important. But I just want to say something about the importance of like connections. It's really, really important to have an advocate. I had advocates, right? My mentor, my doctoral advisor was an advocate. I had many other advocates for me. So it really helped me not only get through my program, but be successful in my program. And as importantly, get strong recommendations to get to all of my next steps. I mean, still to this day, when I apply to any and everything, my postdoctoral mentors are still people who I turn to, right? Like those relationships very much are maintained. Sorry, my internet's a little bit unstable. But I think that the larger point is that, you know, if you don't have an advocate or a mentor, it's important to latch onto someone who's good, right? And who's gonna really invest the time in you, but also help you think through whatever your situation is, because we all are different, right? And again, like Jasmine and I went to the exact same institution, although a little bit different, but we had very, very different experiences. And I don't think it has to do with our personalities or anything else, because personally, we're actually pretty similar, et cetera. But okay, the question was about perseverance. Quite frankly, I think in academia, one of my mentors said something like, expect failure, or expect, you know, like these negative things. I mean, the truth is we don't get grants discussed. People say that our work is stupid. The methods that we use don't make sense. You know, things that really could tear you down. But I didn't talk about like my family, but both my parents are Caribbean immigrants, and you know they came to this country to have a better life. As trite as that may sound, and we just have a work ethic. So I never let when people say things about my science, like really, negatively impacted me. I said, okay, you think this is bad? Well, I'm going to make it better. I remember in graduate school, a friend of mine who was a faculty at that time said to me, well, Dustin, everyone studies neighborhoods, and implied that what I was doing was stupid. And it really hurt my feelings because it's like what I was like passionate about and what I really want to dedicate my life to. But I said, you know what? I'm going to make mine different. I'm going to be different than every other social and spatial epidemiologist out there. And I believe that I've achieved that by doing different methods, but applying my methods to unique populations. I want a whole mindfulness kick in. I've been reading and I'm working on some mindfulness work, but I really center what's important to me and not let my failures, meaning like not getting a grant or someone saying a paper I wrote stupid, impact me at all. I really just kind of use that to get to my goal of getting it accomplished.
I've been at Columbia almost 20 years. And I would say that during that period of time, I've actually had different relations to the institution. And it's interesting being with Marcel because I feel like at some point I was kind of the optimistic one and you were the less optimistic one. And then we switched roles, So I feel that there have been periods where being the lonely only has been quite devastating because it takes such an enormous energy for you to accomplish things that for other people, they don't have to invest that energy in creating conditions, in seeking relationships, in building even, going back to Caesar, building structures for you to do your work. So I would say that on the one hand, it's been very difficult. On the other hand, if you have clarity of purpose and you've been able to build relationships, I think you learn from that. There are things that I'm working on right now and outcomes right now that I don't think I would have arrived quite the same way, or maybe not at all, had I not been addressing these questions. So in that sense, I would say that and this week I wanted to mention, this week has been very intense in these questions that you're raising, Dennis, because I have a course that looked at higher education for the thematic for the session. And I've been doing office hours with students that have been accepted to PhD programs or so-called non-traditional students at Columbia. And they're asking these questions that are indicative of a very critical moment. They're asking, is it worth it to go to the university? Who is responsible for the lack of creativity, for the indebtedness, for all these conditions that we are spending so much time dealing with that are not advancing what we do? In fact, one student mentioning that participating in the strike, that her exhaustion, their exhaustion was so great that you wonder, this is how they break you, right? I mean, these are the kind of questions that the students were raising to me. So brought up a lot of the questions of challenges and why do you stay at the institution despite the challenges? And what is it required, and whether you should spend time adapting to the institutions or trying to change the institutions, or do you spend that time building other types of spaces, or a combination of those? So I feel that in this moment where I think broadly speaking, people speak of a crisis in higher education at so many multiple levels, these questions are very important to bring up and to bring up together, because when the students are raising those questions, these are not questions alien to me as a faculty member. And I think connecting the dots of why things might be the way they are and working together to those that choose to spend the time in that way is one of the few, to me, ways forward at this time.
I would say, if you're in graduate school and you've actually passed your qualifiers and you're moving into that thesis phase, like you definitely have the grit to persevere. But I do think that as a faculty member, it is like yoga. It's a practice. Sometimes I don't do so well, and sometimes I do very well. but it is a practice. And I feel that at each stage of my career, it has been me practicing new ways. And one big grievance happened where I had an award, a K award, and I am the only Black female in a department of about 95 plus. And then when Dustin came, we became 3 Black individuals in a department of 95 plus. And so it's been consistently where I'm, you know, not among a lot of people that are Black and brown. But I had gotten this award. I thought it was a great achievement. It wasn't looked on as a great achievement within the department so much. But of course, the school advertised it and they put your picture and the award. Well, when I went to go see the picture, it wasn't my face. It was another Black female's face that was on their global Mailman School of Public Health Googleable site. And I didn't know how to deal with that. And so, you know, it's a practice in perseverance. And I went at the time to the Vice Dean of Education, Julie Kornfeld. I went to the Vice Dean of Faculty Advancement, Regina Santella. And the people who were in charge of putting the picture up told Dr. Santella she must have did it herself. And I was just like, you know, like it's one injustice after another. And so to me, it was like, okay, I'm persevering, but sometimes it just gets to be too much. And in those times, for you to go another day, you just have to step back. And I definitely, I brought it up to the highest person that I could to address the issue. And they did change policy to make sure that kind of thing didn't happen again. But at that point, I was mad. I was angry. I was what you would call the quintessential angry Black woman. But I was like, I have a right to be. So I think for me, it's just been a practice. And at every stage, I try to learn more skills, more advocacy, but you will continue to persevere. It's not something that you get to this stage of assistant or associate or full, and then you check the box and you're done. If this is your journey, it is a practice that you will have for the rest of the journey.
Wow, is all I can say to that story. Just to provide some context, in the United States of America, there are 13 tenured faculty in astronomy who identify as either Black, Latinx, or Native American. 13. There is no department in the country that has both an African American and a Hispanic, Latino faculty member. So Columbia is no exception to that. And so I made my peace with the idea a few years ago that I was unlikely to spend any fraction of my career, unless I deliberately decided to go somewhere else, with either another Black or Latinx faculty colleague. That's the reality of my field. So, you know, I agree with this idea that it's a practice. I would say that one of the things that has definitely changed for me post tenure has been my ability to choose the environments that I want to be in, and I've developed a rule that if I'm in a space where I have a conversation and then it prevents me from sleeping well that night, that's it. I'm not going back. And I can afford to do that now. I couldn't afford to do that when I was on the tenure track. And so, I'm still learning. I'm still learning, really, even at this point, exactly how to use my voice and when to use it. And institutionally, I think actually outside of Columbia, it's been a lot easier in many ways. But yes, let's see. Oh God, I have so many other things. I'm going to stop there.
of the questions so far, the authenticity of you all on your responses here have been heartwarming. So thank you from me, definitely. So I'm mindful of time also. So I was going to ask you, this final question about what advice do you have for our young men and women here in graduate programs, the majority of which are Black and brown. But a question came up in the chat that I'd love to share, as it might end up being the final question. And if you have advice to share as well, throw that in. But Cindy Meekins, and thank you, Cindy, for the question. Can you discuss how asked to be the voice of authenticity regarding Black and brown concerns is impacting you, your mental health, or your feelings about higher education? Great question. Tough one, but great question.
You cut out a little bit in the beginning. Can you repeat the beginning of the question?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Can you discuss how being asked to voice or be the voice of authenticity regarding Black and brown concerns is impacting you, your mental health, or your feelings about higher ed?
I'm going to echo that in a different way. And I'm mindful of time, and I haven't had enough time to think through it, of course, but I don't like, it's emotionally draining, exhausting that sometimes, and I would say oftentimes, people think that I got to where I am because I'm Black, as opposed to that I stay up all night working, that I'm really mindful about doing the best science possible, that I've connected with the leaders in multiple fields, that many of them not only are my mentors, but strong advocates for my work, and that this has made me internationally recognized, not because I'm Black. Me being Black is, and other things perhaps has encouraged my work ethic, or made me understand that to be seen as equal, I have to be better, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that, I don't think that I quite recognize as a graduate student, and maybe it's because I was really immature, who knows? But at this stage in my career, I would say it's exhausting. And I won't say a deep story, but I'll say a really light story. When I came to Columbia, I was transitioning from NYU to Columbia, and I won't say institutions, but a faculty member said to me, "Oh, are you one of the new diversity hires?" I think there is nothing wrong with being a diversity hire. I think it's critically important for many, 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 many reasons. But I know that my department chair, who is fantastic, reached out to me because he wanted to build my content expertise, which is spatial epidemiology. And so immediately, Dustin Duncan, like Jasmine McDonald, was reduced to being this scholar because I'm a Black scholar, as opposed to me being the scholar because I do strong science. And I know I do strong science. That's why I trained, right? That's the whole point. And similar to Jasmine, it absolutely does become exhausting because I'm not someone, we all have ranges of our bandwidth, intelligence, our work ethic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I know, and amongst my friends, many of whom are academics, that I work really, really hard. So, so to reduce me to that, I would say it's infuriating, or disgusting. Although I do think that I'll use the word exhausting to make it a little bit lighter.
I think Latinx scholars are sometimes so rendered invisible that we're not even that tokenized. But I would say two things that I think are important. One is that is not to internalize the definitions that the institution might have of who you are, or the dimensions or where you're going, because when you do, then it becomes highly toxic, because it's like you're drinking poison, basically. So it does become exhausting, and it does become unproductive and so forth. But knowing that it's politics in the sense that we're in a field, the field that we are, every field that we are is basic political in the sense that there are power relations that are making things move in this or that direction. So when these kinds of situations arise, I try to think about the consequences of my action. So I recognize that sometimes I might decide to do something that I feel is problematic because I think the repercussions of not doing might be greater than the problems that the situation might present to me. Sometimes we're not totally cognizant of all the repercussions of what we do often. But I think going in, that's what I try to focus on. What will my participation say and mean to the things that I care about? And sometimes, just to go back to the question of perseverance, and sometimes I feel that the best thing to do is not persevere and walk away or go underground, go in the undercommons, with like-minded people and do something other than what you're being asked to do. So in that sense, I don't think there's to me, not a single answer, or it depends on context, and it depends on what you want to accomplish with your participation in any given situation.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think it's, again, a luxury, something of a luxury of our own post-tenure status, Francis, that we can take those attitudes, right? I will say that there's a whole other dimension to this question. I mean, it's always been very clear to me that I speak for myself and nobody else. And you want to assign some other weight to that, that's really your problem, right? Not mine. But I will say that I think the events over the last year, and the Trump presidency in general, and then the culmination over the last year, have changed the dynamic tremendously. And suddenly there's this whole like massive enthusiasm for going to faculty of color, people of color in general, and being like, okay, we're ready to listen, like, tell us. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, I'm going to tell you the same thing I said 2 weeks ago. I mean, from my perspective, the issues are they're no different now than they were before. So I think if there's a whole other commentary here to address that, but I think that, if anything, the way that I see my frustration about that is related to that. It's the sudden sense of we have to do anything, something, we have to address, and meanwhile, there have been these systemic problems that we've been trying to highlight, from everything from graduate admissions to faculty hiring for decades. And the solutions are out there, and we know what they are, and yet now it's like, oh, we got to do something. Let's start this new initiative, and so on and so forth. And you're like, well, no, actually, why don't we just go back and do the things that we said all along we should be doing to address these situations? So if there is a specific frustration of this moment for me, it's that. It's the way that now people are suddenly attuned, woke to diversity issues. And that's what I called Manu about last night, because I was in this meeting and I was just like, I cannot believe the ways in which we think we're addressing these issues, and yet at the end of it, white privilege rules. Nonetheless. All right, I'll stop there before I rant on for hours.
That was absolutely not a rant. I am so grateful to the four of you for this conversation today. And I know we're just touching on things, but I'm grateful to be able to touch on them for our students in particular, who are going through much of what we've been discussing here ourselves, those same thoughts themselves. So I'm going to turn it over to Melissa, and I thank all of you in the audience who weathered with us. I know we've run over, but thank you all for staying.
Yes, thank you so much for staying. And thank you to our panelists and moderator for sharing their time and experiences with our students. I just want to remind everyone that today's event is part of the Graduate Initiative for Inclusion and Engagement. This is only one of a series of events throughout the semester. We have 2 workshops focused on understanding and managing procrastination, as well as working from home, coming up. So be sure to check out our events calendar, which has been included in the chat, for details and registration info. I'd also like to extend a big thank you to everyone who attended and participated. We hope that you were able to gain a lot out of today's conversation. Lastly, you will receive a feedback form in a follow-up email, and we encourage you to fill it out with any feedback you might have so that we can continue to put on events that serve your needs and interests as students. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe and healthy, and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Bye.
Thank you.